A few months ago, I was doing something and all of a sudden a notification popped up on my phone. It was for an event that was pretty nebulous to me, an event that I didn't understand or know much about, and it was happening at Lake Ann on the plaza. And it was this dinner. And I didn't fully understand what was going on, but my friend Melissa Romano, who owns the brew house at Lake Ann, had sent it out, and it was something that was happening in the community. And I have a lot of FOMO. I don't want to miss out on things that are happening in the community. So I said, all right, I'll go. I want to see what it is. So I found out later that Eve Thompson was part of it, and Melissa Romano was planning this. And I reached out to Melissa, and I said, what is this thing? And she goes, we're just going to all come and have dinner on the plaza. It's going to be an evening. It was a Sunday evening. And folks can bring their stuff, and we're going to all sit down and have dinner. And it's going to be a super cool thing. And she said, if 50 people show up, I'll be really excited. Well, I got there right when it was supposed to start, and there were already at least 100 people there sitting on the plaza. They had brought tables. Some folks had brought china and linens and like candles, and it was lighting up. I had brought like camping chairs. Okay, I had not brought all these beautiful things. And in fact, we had not brought a table. We had brought chairs and we had brought some food. So somebody came that we knew from here, Beth, and she brought a table, and we sat down and we sat around the table, and then the family that was beside us didn't have a table. So somebody came and brought them a table. And then I noticed that there was like this communal area where they were putting food. And all these people put their food out for different people to eat, and they filled the table, and the table got so full, there was no more room, so people who brought their food started walking down this long table. I mean, it was a table that went down the whole plaza, and they were like waiting on people, sharing their food all the way down. I mean, a beautiful, beautiful experience to look around and see different colored linens and different tablecloths and stuff, but one big table that lined the plaza. And there were a couple of things. I mean, I think there ended up being like over 250 people that showed up that night. It was a really beautiful thing, and I noticed all of God's children are sitting along, like, I mean, you get to have dinner on the lake. It's kind of a cool thing, right? But all of God's children sitting down, having dinner on the lake. And I realized two things at that meal. One, sometimes all it takes is an invitation. You just got to put it out there. People didn't know exactly where it was going, but sometimes, yeah, here are pictures of it, by the way. How cool is this, right? You want to all be part of it, don't you? You're watching it, you want to be part of it. There will be more. But think about this. See this table? This is where the food was. And it was this beautiful, beautiful event. But two things I learned. One is sometimes all you have to do is put out an invitation. And the second thing is, I believe everybody wants to sit around the table. I believe everybody wants to come to the table. And this event was a beautiful, beautiful example of these things. We're in our fourth and final week of this sermon series we're called Making Room. And the idea was we wanted to get before the big Christmas season and start helping people prepare to how to make room between this time of Thanksgiving and Christmas. How do you make room for the things that are going to matter? How do you make room for things that are important? Especially this week, heading in to Thanksgiving, I wanted to save this title, this topic, and this topic is making room around the table. How do you make room around your table for other people? Now, some of you hear that, and you instantly say, well, Tim, it's really simple. You just put out another place setting. You push people around. You get one more folding chair, and there's plenty of room at your table. I want to try to argue this morning that I think making room around the table is much more than a place setting or a chair. Making room around the table is actually, in my opinion, an issue of the heart. It's how you make room in your heart for the people who might sit around your table. You know, you might say, Tim, that's cheesy, right? You're talking heart language. Stay with me for just a little bit. Journey with me a little bit this morning, because I think it is an important concept now to think about how we make room in our heart for the people who we should invite to our table. I am finding myself in today's culture at places where I am being uninvited more and more often to tables, and where I, in my own heart, am uninviting others to the table. Because of political, society, different issues and things, where I am finding that there are such boundaries that are put in place that we can't even sit down and talk about certain things anymore. That we find ourselves in a place that is more difficult than I have experienced in my own very short life, right? Very difficult. But it's not a new problem. It's not a new thing, this thing where people can't sit around the table and talk to each other. Jesus dealt with it in the first century. It's a first century challenge. I want to take you this morning to Luke chapter 14, where Jesus tells this parable. And a parable was a story that Jesus told that would have been in the language and sort of common colloquial understanding of things that people would have gotten. Jesus replied, it says, a certain man hosted a large dinner and invited many people. When it was time for the dinner to begin, he sent his servant to tell the invited guests, "Come, the dinner is now ready." One by one, they all began to make excuses. The first one told him, "I bought a farm and must go and see it. Please excuse me." Another one said, "I bought 5 teams of oxen and I'm going to check on them. Please excuse me." Another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." When he returned, the servant reported these excuses to his master. The master of the house became angry and said to his servant, "Go quickly to the city's streets, the busy ones and the side streets, and bring the poor, crippled, blind, and lame." The servant said, "Master, your instructions have been followed, and there is still room." The master said to the servant, "Go to the highways and back alleys and urge people to come in so that my house will be filled. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will taste my dinner." Whew. That's a story, right? That's a story for those who are listening about coming to the table, right? Jesus tells this parable, this story, that he wants to give these poignant messages to someone who might hear something powerful about this. Now, I read this story the first time this week again, and I read it and I said, those sound like pretty darn good excuses to me, right? Somebody just got married. They probably don't want to come to your table, right? Somebody just bought 5. I've never bought 5 oxen, right? If I just bought land, I might want to go check it out. So I was like, when I first read it, I'm like, well, this is kind of dumb that they're mad about this. This is important stuff. But I'm also not in the first century. It's possible in the first century that after you have a wedding, you don't go away for 2 weeks so no one sees you. Right? It's possible that you buy oxen every day. It's possible that purchasing a field's just not that big of a deal. I mean, look at the text. It says, but they all alike began to make what? Excuses. Excuses implies they were trying to find a way not to be there. The first said, "I've just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me." Still another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." So after I sat on this a little bit this week and I said, what in the world does this have to do with coming to the table? I thought, what if they just didn't want to be at that guy's table? What if they were afraid of the other people that were invited and didn't think about being able to sit down with them? What if the issue was they had been at that table before and it wasn't a safe place? What if their concern was about being in conversation with people? These 2 women, Lynn Flowers and Jen Bailey, they've been trying to figure out this problem. They said ever since the 2016 election, they feel like things are heightened between people. Tension is heightened. And they said, we want to do something to make a difference because all we do is sit around and talk about how everybody's always mad at each other. So they started this thing called the People's Dinner. Have you heard of this? People's Dinner, really, really interesting thing where they decided they were going to get as many people from around the country to sit around tables and have dinner together as possible. Because what they knew was actually getting around the table and sitting around and having a meal together broke down some of the barriers that people have in their lives. So they found when they started investigating this before they launched the dinners that people had 2 things in common. One is that people were very emotionally charged. Do you think their finding is correct? People get angry very quickly. They get upset. They put up their walls. They put up their boundaries. But the second thing was people were hungry to understand why and to break the silos, but they were afraid to actually be in conversation with people and do it. They wanted to not be in these silos where everyone thought like them, but they were afraid to step out of them. So they started these dinners. In the first months, they helped people have more than 100 suppers across the country. More than 100 different groups of people have suppers. Now they've had over 1,000 suppers across the country. Because they believe that getting people around the table matters. They believe that it actually breaks down some of the barriers. They believe that conversations happen. Now, they learned a few things from these dinners. And this was important because they had to share these things before people would have them. Here's the first thing they learned. Unity does not mean sameness. Just because you sit around a table with someone does not mean you have to agree on every single topic. It does not mean, when did that become a reality? Right? I grew up in a house where people rarely agreed around the table, but we still sat. And they said, just because you're sitting around a table with someone does not mean you have to conform to what they believe in. And it does not also mean that you have to convince them to believe what you believe in. It's just a meal. Right? It does not mean sameness. Sitting around the table with people does not mean that you all have to agree. But here's something else they learned, and this was really important. In order to be at the same table together successfully, you have to set expectations. What are boundaries around being at the table together? We're not going to beat each other up, right? Sounds basic. It's like the plot line of every good family Christmas movie, right? Where some fight ends up between someone. Or they suggested that you come to the table with statements that you're going to offer people. For example, someone brings something up that they know pushes your buttons. You'd say, hey, I'd prefer not to talk about that right now. And then you keep eating. I know, novel concept, right? I'd prefer not to talk about that right now. Or would it be possible if we talked about something different? Or, hey, maybe later we could have this conversation, but right now I just want to eat my turkey. All fair things. To just put boundaries in place and still love the person that you're putting the boundary in for. When I was in Bethlehem a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go and have dinner with a family in Bethlehem. It was one of the parts of the tour group. And they said, hey, you can pay this extra money, and if so, you get to go have dinner with a family in Bethlehem. And I thought that was a pretty cool concept, and I made this commitment when I went that I was going to do every single thing that was possible. So we went and we drove. It took about an hour to get from our hotel because Jerusalem was really, really busy. And then we got to this place where we were entering Palestine, right, which is where Bethlehem is. And when you enter Palestine, it is not as welcoming as entering Jerusalem, because there are multiple people with very large guns that are standing there. And you realize that is less about me coming in and more about people going out. So they're protecting the gates, but we get in and we get to this parking lot, and all of a sudden they start dispersing all of us very quickly to get in cars with different people that we don't know and to go to their homes and have meals. And I, along with some folks from Restoration, our team kind of stayed together, and we went to dinner at this guy's house. It was actually his mom's house, but we didn't figure that out for a little while. She cooked the dinner. But we got in the house, and they had the table set out so nicely in the dining room. They had 2 tables there, and there was plenty of room for all of us to sit around. I think there were eight of us that were sitting around the table. And the food was really, really good. And we moved very quickly from tell me about your family to tell me about what it's like to live in Palestine right now. And what's it like to be a Christian in Palestine? It was a fascinating conversation, and he told us about some of the challenges. He could only leave Palestine 1 month of the year to go to the Holy City. It was during December. So really interesting things. But then he went on and we said, what would you want us to know? And he said, what I would want you to know is that not all Palestinians are terrorists. He said, that's a really important thing for you to know. He goes, I know what you see, but not all Palestinians are terrorists. And we said, okay. And he said, because I want to tell you, I watch the news sometimes, and I see in your country, young white men go and they kill people. He said, so I have to think every time one of you comes into my home that not all white people are terrorists. Now I want you to think about that for just a second. Think about that. And he was very kind. He was like laughing as he's saying it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're letting us into your house. This is a really, really big deal. And we had this beautiful conversation about how folks in his community have different faiths and different backgrounds, and they live together in these places, and how they work together, and how they encourage one another. And it was this really interesting picture because, friends, I don't know about you, but when I think of Palestine, that's not always the thing I think about, is people being able to sit around a table and living in community together. So this is the picture of us with George right here in the front, and George's mom right there by Sharon, as they provided dinner for us. And it was a really beautiful, beautiful thing. We couldn't have been more welcomed. They made room around their table. We had a beautiful dinner, and then we left. It was a beautiful picture of people making room at their table for people who were different from them. Beautiful, beautiful picture. Powerful, powerful experience. When people ask me, what were your powerful experiences, I rarely say when I went in the maybe tomb that maybe Jesus was put in. I talk about the dinner where I got to sit around the table with George, where he shared the story. Friends, Jesus made room around the table. That's the business that he was in. He made room for people. He made room for people who were different from him. He made room for sinners, the vulnerable, those who didn't know who they were. He made room for those who felt invisible. And people regularly asked him, do you know what one of the greatest charges against him was? Why do you keep making room? Why are you welcoming these people around your table? The charge is things like, you went to eat dinner at that person's house? You talked to that person? And Jesus looked at them as if it was the most ridiculous line of questioning in the world. Of course I did. They need people to eat with. They need someone to care for them. I mean, in the parable that Jesus tells, he says this, then the master told his servant, go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full. Jesus didn't even wait to see if you wanted to come. That's the funny thing. So often, I think when I talk to people, they say things like, well, I don't know my neighbors, but they've never really stepped out. Right? They don't look like they'd like to have dinner. What? They probably eat dinner every day. Right? And Jesus, in this passage, it says, he compelled them to come in. The story seems as if to say Jesus is telling us, go out and fill your table. And guess what? They might not all be like you. One of them might have just gotten married. One of them might have just bought some oxen, and one of them might have just bought land. But invite them to the table, because it is around the table where we break into these conversations, where we break the silos and the barriers that we've created. Jesus wants the table to be full. He is not willing to settle for empty seats because he knows that people are hungry. I mean, the master in this story is like belligerent about this. All right, they didn't want to come, then go get those people. Then go get those people. Then go get those people. The people who try to sell in the world an exclusive Jesus have not read this passage. The people who try to suggest that there are people Jesus chooses and people Jesus doesn't have not read this passage. Go out into the streets and get them all. And bring them where? To the table. To sit around the table and to have conversations. Friends, sitting around the table is about building relationships. It's about pausing to listen to people's stories. I encourage you, when you do, to have appropriate boundaries. That's okay. Be safe. But when you sit around the table, be inquisitive. Even if people are different from you, especially if they are. If they have different views and different thoughts. We need spaces where people can be themselves, where people can be in community. Friends, we can't change the world in isolation. Do you know that? We can't. We can't change the world in isolation, but we can do it in the midst of community. But not when every single person in our community thinks and acts exactly like we do. We have to step out. So I want to encourage you, make room in your heart. Be open. There's a couple of invitations I need to put out. There's a couple of people I need to invite. Making room at the table is not simply about making another place setting. You know what I loved about the dinner at Lake Ann? I was not prepared when I showed up. I did not have a candelabra. Our china has not been out for years. Yet I can't tell you how gracious and welcoming folks were. How the table was put out. I mean, you want to see a picture of community? Can you go back to those pictures? There you go. That's community. Right there. Hey, and next time I put out that invitation to y'all come. Because it's a beautiful experience to sit around the table with God's children. You know what I've come to believe? People ask me what heaven is like. You know what I come to believe heaven is like? Just a big old long table where everybody gets to sit around and eat, where you don't have to have it all figured out, where you don't have to all be the same. Heck, I bet there's no politics in heaven. That's all right, isn't it? I long for earth to be more like heaven.